Hi guys, and welcome back to my channel. The case that I'm going to be looking into today is the case of Jane Longhurst. She was a teacher who disappeared in early 2003, and it's just a pretty disturbing case, so let's get into it. It was suggested by Ian, so thank you for that. I appreciate any suggestions you guys have, and of course, if you do have any more, please do let me know and I'll look into them for you. Jane Longhurst was born on the 6th of November in 1971 to parents Bill and Liz Longhurst. They had 2 children together, 2 daughters. Jane was the youngest, her older sister was called Sue, and there was 8 years difference between them. Liz really felt thankful that she ended up having Jane and really doted on her because she was actually around 40 years old at the time, and you know, obviously the older you get, the more riskier and things, the more complicated childbirth and having children can be for your health, and you can get more complications, things like that. And she was just so thankful that she managed to have her. They ended up having a really, really close relationship and they adored each other. They were like best friends. She described her as a late blessing because obviously her age and things like that. I guess she thought that she would only have 1 child, and then surprise, along comes another, Jane. Now, unfortunately, Bill did end up passing away. It was a couple of years before this case happened. It was in the year 2000, which is really, obviously, it's really sad that they lost Bill. In the same sense, you could think of it not as a blessing. I'm not saying that anybody losing their life is a blessing. It is not. But he never had to live with what happened to Jane, which in a way could be seen as a nice thing. I don't want to be disrespectful or anything like that, and you know what I mean, but at least he never knew what happened to his littlest girl, which is so awful what happened to her, and he never got that tragedy in his life. You know what I mean. Please don't take that as disrespect, because I don't mean it as that at all. Jane was a lovely person. She was described as being so full of life, so joyful, just so kind-hearted, really. She did really well in school. She got on with everyone there. She excelled in her exams. She was very intelligent, and she also enjoyed doing her favourite hobby, which was music. She ended up playing a few instruments, flute, piano, but her main one was the violin. She absolutely adored to play the violin, which she started, I believe, around the age 5. She was very young when she began playing it, and she was very good at it. She was a talented musician and wanted to pursue a career in that passion. And why not? If you love something so much, why not make a job out of it? That is what she wanted to do, and that is what she ended up doing. She moved down to Brighton to follow that passion. She ended up playing in a local orchestra, playing the violin, and she also soon got a full-time job working in a special needs school, where she obviously taught children with special needs. A few years after she moved, she began a relationship with a man named Malcolm. Eventually, the pair would move into a flat together. They enjoyed a happy relationship, and her new life in Brighton was amazing. She had the job she wanted. She had met this man who she absolutely adored. Everything was going fantastic for Jane. And because of all this, because her life was going so well, because everything was brilliant, it came as a massive shock when in 2003, she just simply vanished off the face of the earth. We skip forward to Friday the 14th of March in 2003. Jane had actually made plans to meet up with her mother Liz in London because they were going to this art gallery or something like that. They were going to visit and look around that. Now, Liz ended up being ill, I believe, and they ended up rescheduling their plans. So basically, Jane's plan then was to just stay at home, you know, have a day at home. Their plans had fallen through because of her illness, well, her mother's illness, so she just didn't have anything else planned. So Malcolm gets home from work in the evening and Jane is not there. He thought it was pretty odd because he assumed that she would be at home because, again, her plans had fallen through and she'd only planned to stay at home. Now, you may think, well, she's just nipped to the shop or something like that. But the thing with Jane was she would always tell people where she was going. So if she had nipped out somewhere, she would have messaged Malcolm to say, I've nipped out, I'm going swimming, I've gone to the shop. Whatever she was going to do, she would have told him. But he had heard nothing of her. so he found it very, very strange. She didn't want people to worry about her, so she would always tell them where she was. He tried to phone a few times, but it just went through to voicemail, so either it had run out of battery or it had been turned off. And then about an hour later, he calls up Liz. He thinks that maybe she did end up meeting with her mum after all, or maybe her mum knew where she was, or something like that. But Liz hadn't heard of Jane either. She didn't really panic initially because she asked him if he had checked this local youth orchestra club thing. It was where Jane volunteered often to teach children how to play the violin. So obviously Malcolm's thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't even think about that. Thank you, I'll go and ring them. So he rings them. Jane is also not there, and he calls back Liz again to tell her that she wasn't at home, she hadn't gone there, she wasn't with her mom. You know, Malcolm rang around her friends, nobody knew where she was, and they were just getting more and more worried about her. It was totally out of character for Jane to do something like that, to have people worry about her. If she was able to tell them where she was going, she would have. So the early hours of the next day, the Saturday, still no word of Jane. Nobody knew where she was. The friends, nobody knew nothing. And Malcolm felt it was time to call the police and report her as a missing person, which is exactly what he did. They went round to the flat, they asked Malcolm some questions, began interviewing, trying to figure out what was what, like, you know, what she'd left behind, what she'd taken, as she packed her bag and gone, kind of thing. So they figured out that her phone was missing, her bank cards were missing, so she'd obviously taken them with her. But from what they could see, she'd gone out in the clothes on her back. There was no bag packed, there was no real clothes missing apart from the ones she probably would have been wearing. Either way, it all looked like she was planning on coming back. She wasn't planning on running away and leaving, she was planning on coming back. She had nothing on her apart from those items. So she had left the flat at some point during the evening, and with the plans to return, but never did. So what happened to her? Police, as with any other case, they began looking into everything, questioning people around the area, neighbours, literally anybody that may know something as to where Jane had gone, but no one knew anything. You know, before long, 48 hours had passed by, she was still missing, and they had no new leads, so it was referred to the CID, which is the Criminal Investigations Department. At that point, they were really, really worried for her because normally a lot of missing persons cases return within 24 hours or they are found within 24 hours. And, you know, with a friend or something like that, they realise that the family's worried, they ring up and tell them that they're fine. You know, something along those lines, but there was nothing with Jane. And this is when police began to think that this was probably very serious. She had a good life. Everything was going really well for her. It was unlikely that she had simply run away, especially not even packing a bag or anything like that. They began to look through Jane's bank because obviously if she has legged it and started a new life, she's going to need money. She's going to need to use those sorts of things. Her phone, her bank, those were the only things she took with her. So she's going to need them, isn't she? Well, she hadn't actually used her bank since the day that she went missing. Also, her phone had not been used since those last phone calls she had made on the day she was last seen. One of the last phone calls that she actually made was to her best friend Lisa, and that was the Friday morning, that sort of before she went missing. So what had actually happened is she tried to ring Lisa that morning, but Lisa was actually in work, so her partner picked up the phone, and his name was Graham Coots. He had answered the phone. You know, they were good friends. Him and Jane were good friends. Jane was good friends with Lisa. And he told her that obviously Lisa was at work. This was one of the last phone calls that she made, so seemingly Graham was one of the last people to speak to her, at least on the phone anyway. Obviously, once she left, she could have met somebody else and talked to them, but going off what the information that they have, he was one of the last people to at least speak to her on the phone. So obviously the police go around, they speak to Graham, they took a statement from him, and the detectives just have so many people at this point to look into. Obviously, they're going to look into Malcolm. They have Graham to look into, and they've just got so many people that they have to try and look into and try and figure things out. And obviously, the boyfriend is one of the main suspects normally in every case. They were questioning Jane's music teacher. Again, they were just looking into pretty much everyone, because anyone could have made Jane disappear. They just essentially wanted to rule people out so that it gave them a smaller pool of suspects. So as the police are questioning all these people, the investigation really did grow. in the news. It got out there. The police began, there were lots of police on the case. They began going door-to-door inquiries. They were basically talking to everyone and anyone. They were trawling through hours and hours of CCTV footage of routes that possibly she could have taken, the streets surrounding, just anything that they could look into. They were looking at railway stations, bus stations. Maybe she had she had left and she'd taken one of those. Just anything to try and spot her, but they didn't spot her on any of that. This is when they turned to the public for help. Liz did a public appeal where she urged for any information, on Jane's disappearance, for anyone to come forward that knew anything. And from that, they did get tips. They did get sort of suspects and leads, sightings, people saying, I've seen her there, I've seen her here, there and everywhere. But unfortunately, when they did look into all of those, it never proved to be Jane. So 2 weeks pass by. They still have no idea what happened to her. And at this point, the police are thinking that this is going to be more sinister than a missing person. That potentially, it could be more of a murder investigation at this point. Or even not murder. If she had accidentally, fell over and died. Just basically that she was no longer alive, because after 2 weeks, she'd still not accessed her bank accounts. She'd still not used a mobile phone. Nobody had seen her. There was just literally nothing. Like, she just fully dropped off the face of the earth. Obviously, they're hoping that she would be found alive, but it was looking more and more likely that that would not be the case. The police were still doing massive scale searches. They were searching forests, woodlands nearby, anything, everywhere. Honestly, it was huge, the search they did for her, but it just led nowhere. More weeks go by. Almost 5 weeks later, there was a massive development in the case. A body was discovered. It was 20 miles away from Brighton, and it was on the 19th of April. Daniel Fowler, who is a local man, was driving down this road. It was past something called Wigan Hulk Common. I believe it's a massive wooded area, and the road sort of drives down the side of it. And as he's driving along, he notices that there is a fire near to the trees. So it had been quite dry, and obviously he figured that he should report it to the fire brigade. So that is what he does. He calls the fire department up, tells them that there's a fire in the woodland, that he doesn't want to spread any further, gives them his location, and the fire department comes out. So he jumps in his car, figuring that his work is done here. He's called in the fire, and the firemen are here to put it out. Fire people, because not all of them are men, some are women. So they are going to put it out, and off he goes. So he starts driving off, and then he looks in his mirror and realizes that one of the firemen are actually chasing him. So this man catches up. He stops his car. This man catches up and says, "We're going to need you to come back." And he's like, "Well, why?" And he says, "Well, it's not just a fire. It's a body burning." So the police were immediately called to the area. David gave his statement as to what he saw and what had happened. And obviously the fire department put the fire out. They discovered that the victim was female, was completely naked apart from a pair of tights wrapped around her neck. And it was actually determined that the body had not been on fire for very long before it was put out. So pretty much the police said to him, if he had driven past just 2 minutes earlier, he probably would have seen this person lighting the fire. Which I just found totally insane. Literally 2 minutes. It's just wow. He could have been driving past and seen the person setting the body on fire. But it was just 2 minutes difference. Obviously, with a female adult body being discovered, the team looking into Jane Longhurst's disappearance were informed, and it basically just disheartened them so much because they thought that it probably was Jane. Eventually, they did an autopsy and they discovered that, yes, this body was that of 31-year-old Jane Longhurst, who at that point had been missing for 5 weeks. What they also found during this autopsy was that she had actually been deceased for 5 weeks also. So they put her time of death around the day that she actually went missing, which is very strange because that would mean that she was murdered on the day she went missing. She had been deceased for 5 long weeks, and whoever did this waited 5 weeks to dispose of her body. So they must have kept it somewhere for literally over a month. They confirmed that Jane's cause of death was strangulation, and it confirmed what they already thought, that she'd been murdered. She was then taken to the woods and set on fire to try and get rid of the evidence, get rid of the body. At the scene, they found tarpaulin remnants, some bits of clothing, and a small piece of burnt corrugated cardboard with the word fragile printed on it. So now, after discovering Jane's body, they began looking back through what they'd already looked over, all of the case, all the interviews that they'd done, all the suspects that they had. Mostly they were looking at the people that had last seen her, so the details that they had actually given. And as you already know, Graham was one of those people to have last seen her. So they look over that and they begin to realise that he actually didn't give them a whole lot of information on the matter. He was just very vague and not very informative, and looking back over that, it sent up a red flag. So they decided to speak to him again. They go to Graham's, he invites them in, and what they notice in his hallway is some cardboard boxes with corrugated cardboard boxes with the word fragile printed on them. So that immediately sends up even more red flags, because obviously that is what they found close to the body, burning. He says that he's some sort of delivery driver or something like that, and he was making deliveries at the time that her body was found. I don't know what he said his alibi was for the time that she went missing, but at the time that she was found, he said that he was doing deliveries. They asked for receipts as proof of this. He comes back with a bunch of receipts. None of them are from that day, like at all. They're all from like the week before or something like that. So you can't really prove that way that he was making deliveries, because he just had nothing to prove it with. He again gave a very bland account. He was not giving them straight answers, and so they decided to arrest Graham Coots on the suspicion of the murder of Jane Longhurst. They couldn't prove what he was saying was untrue, but they also could not prove that it was true. So obviously, if he had provided the receipts, which were time-stamped, etc., date-stamped, that would have been more proof of a solid alibi. However, he didn't have those, so they couldn't prove it or disprove it. And despite those suspicions they had over him, they had nothing concrete linking him to Jane, and so they had no choice but to let him go. He was still their main suspect though, so they would dig deeper, look more into him, and hopefully, if he did this, gather the evidence that they needed to then charge him. That was the plan. Then, 2 days after Graham was released, they get this phone call from a owner of a local storage place. He had actually seen Jane's case on the news, he had been following it, and he decided that he was going to report something as suspicious. He had recently got a customer in one of his ground floor storage units, and he just thought how this person was acting was very odd. This person who rented the storage unit would continuously come back to the storage unit, go inside, leave, come back, go inside, leave, over a long period of time. And it was odd for his line of work, because normally people store things away in there. They store things that they no longer need or whatever. Say you're moving house, or you no longer have a house, or it's not big enough and you've got all this furniture, you buy a storage unit, you bung it all in there, you kind of forget about it, you don't go back. That is what would normally happen. Obviously, that's not what always happens. I am not saying that by any means, but normally, from his experience as well, that's normally what happens. But that wasn't the only thing that he thought was odd. There was a strange smell coming from his storage unit. And on the weekend that Jane's body was actually discovered on fire in the woods, the smell just vanished. Poof, gone. So they look into it. This customer, he said, was called Paul Kelly. Now, obviously, their main suspect was Graham Coots. So they're thinking, oh, well, maybe, our suspicions are incorrect. And they begin to look into Paul Kelly. This company has CCTV everywhere. He gets it up. They look at the CCTV and they find that actually Paul Kelly is a made-up name for Graham Coots. It's actually Graham Coots. So with all this, they gain access to the unit, and when they go inside, they find some vital evidence. They find Jane's clothes, her bank card, her mobile phone. They also found a blue shirt with blood on it and semen, and it was believed that this was probably the shirt that Graham wore the day that he killed Jane. So basically, Graham had murdered Jane, and he had then stored her body in a storage unit for 5 weeks. He was returning to that body on numerous occasions, and I'm not going to get into the details, but you guys can guess what this sick man was doing. Probably once her body began to smell, he then took it out and he burnt it at the side of that road in the woods. You would think really that he would at least put it a bit further in so that it wouldn't have necessarily been spotted, but well, I'm thankful that it was, obviously, I'm not saying that, but you know, you would have just thought he would have just put it a bit more out of sight, really. So now the main question was, how did he literally get a body from a storage unit to maybe his car without anybody seeing it, without it being flagged up on CCTV, without any suspicion whatsoever? It was very odd. So they go back, they look at the CCTV once more, and this is what they found. Now, this is on the 18th, but as you can see, that day Graham entered the warehouse, he picked up a trolley and he took it with him. So it takes it in an elevator to the ground floor of the building where his storage unit was, and then he's caught on that same CCTV about 6 or 7 minutes later coming back out of the elevator with his trolley, but this time on the trolley there's a massive cardboard box. He's wheeling it around, he leaves the building with this box, he takes it towards his car, and that is where the police believe that he had put Jane's body. He had put it inside that cardboard box and he had hidden it from the CCTV and any prying eyes, which is just so eerie and creepy and disgusting to think that inside that box was poor Jane's body. The CCTV then shows him going back to returning the trolley that he had used. You can see Graham once again on the cameras outside of the elevators, and you see him with some tissue, and then he's mopping up an area on the floor. Police believe that he did this because that when he was wheeling out Jane's body, he noticed that, you know, some things had dropped down onto the floor and were left behind, and he obviously realized that and he cleaned it up. He then apparently left her in the car overnight, and then the very next day he dumps her in the woods and sets her on fire to try and get rid of evidence. On the 29th of April in 2003, 36-year-old Graham Coots was charged with the murder of Jane Longhurst. Then, on the 12th of April in 2004, which was just sort of over a year after Jane was killed, he went to trial and he pled not guilty. He basically said that he did kill her, but it was accidental. So, that day, she had rang up Lisa. She had wanted to go and see her or whatever, and Graham had said that she wasn't there. They'd planned on, I don't know, he mentioned something about swimming. Don't know whether they decided that they were going to go swimming. They ended up kissing romantically. He took her back to his place. They ended up having sexual relations. And then apparently Jane wanted to try something new, and he accidentally strangled her to death during sex, apparently. That's what the defense put forward. The prosecution basically rebuffed it and said that it would have took minutes, like 3-4 minutes, for him to fully strangle someone. There's no way that he's gotten carried away and accidentally killed her. It just wasn't well received. It wasn't really believed. And no wonder. Again, it's one of them cases where the male is trying to blame the female by saying that she wanted rough sexual relations, and then because of that, she died. It's so frustrating. Poor Jane, the victim, was being made out to be a villain, kind of. Basically, it came out that he actually had an obsession with strangling women and the act of suffocation, which is what he did to Jane. And then he stored her body in a unit. He visited that unit on many occasions, I think between 7 and 9 times over that 5 weeks. So you just know that what he's saying is a load of garbage. And the jury knew it too. It took him 9 hours to come back with a guilty verdict. Graham Coots was found guilty of the murder of Jane Longhurst. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. That isn't where the case ends though, because not long after he was actually sentenced, in January of 2005, he went ahead and appealed his conviction. He actually asked for a retrial. His defense team wanted it to go to another jury, and I have no idea why, but his request was granted. I don't get why he had a second trial. I don't think that's very fair at all. What came of it was just the same result. The second jury, the whole new jury that he wanted, also found him guilty of murder of Jane. That trial began in June of 2007. They came to the same verdict. However, this time he was sentenced with a life sentence with a minimum of 26 years. So, you know, it shaved some time off. It was less than his first sentence, but I honestly don't know what he thought would happen. Did he think that the second jury would find him not guilty? I don't know. Either way, he is, at the moment, spending his life in prison. And there's probably a massive, really high probability that he won't ever be released anyway. So yeah, what happened to Jane was so tragic. She had a life on track. She had everything she wanted, and this monster, I don't even know, he was supposed to be a friend of hers, and I don't know, took her life. Why? We have no clue. Just a very, very sick person, and it's just awful. My heart obviously goes out to the family of Jane. It's just, these cases are so horrific. Why do we live in such an evil world? But yeah, that's the end of the case. If you guys have enjoyed this video, give me a big thumbs up, subscribe to the channel for similar content. Anyway guys, that's all I have today on the case of Jane Longhurst. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, bye.